Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wilson. I am excited today because Phyllis Fagell is joining me for a very important conversation. Phyllis is a licensed clinical professional counselor in a school in Washington, D.C. She's a therapist who works with children and teens, and she's an author and journalist. Today, we are talking about key skills kids need to thrive in middle school and beyond. And as a parent of a middle schooler and a fourth grader, this really hits home. And I know it's going to be an important conversation for not only parents of kids who think and learn differently, but for parents who have a middle schooler at home. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hi, Phyllis. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It is so nice to finally meet you. We've conversed via email messages back and forth, but it's really nice to be able to see you.
It is. It makes such a big difference to see your face.
It really does. And like I said to you before we started recording, two people recommended that I have conversations with you. One was Debbie Reber, and the other was Elizabeth Hamblett, both who have been on this podcast and do a lot of work with students who think and learn differently. And so I'm thrilled that they made this connection.
I'm honored. They're both great resources too. So
absolutely. Now, you are the author of two very important books for adults who have or work with middle school students. One is Middle School Matters, the 10 key skills kids need to thrive in middle school and beyond, and how parents can help. And the newer book, Middle School Superpowers, Raising Resilient Tweens in Turbulent Times. And as I said to you before we started, I read your first book and I've got Post-it notes everywhere. I have not read your second one yet. And I said, when I finish the second one, I'll probably have to have you back on the podcast for sure.
Well, I love that you have a sixth grader in your house and this is so relevant in your own life.
It is so relevant. And I also said I have like a fourth grader, so he's coming up pretty quickly into that middle school year, and those middle school years is quickly approaching. So this is right on time for me personally.
Great.
I'd love to start with a why, because, I'm thinking about your two books and the title of the first one says it all. Why does middle school matter? And what led you to focus on this particular stage of development?
So I work with kids of all ages in both the school and private setting. And it's not that I prefer middle schoolers or that I think middle schoolers are inherently more difficult to work with. It's simply that I felt they were being maligned, that all of the cultural narrative about middle school is that it's this horrible time to dread. That wasn't my experience at all. My dog is saying hello.
Hello.
And I also was a relatively new middle school counselor at the time I started working on this book. I wasn't a new counselor, but I was new to the age group. So I wanted to nerd out and read a lot about the age, and there really wasn't anything at all. And it's such a distinct phase with such distinct needs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you talk about that mix of hormonal changes, the shift in relationships, and the increased expectations, which I talk about a lot on the podcast, academic expectations, social expectations, expectations at home. It can be a very tumultuous time. And I love that you say that rather than merely helping kids survive this time, that we should look instead to help them thrive.
Yeah, I call middle school the last best chance because it is this unique spot in their development where they're still really malleable and impressionable. And at the same time, they're sophisticated. They still care what their parents think. They've started to pull away, but they aren't yet so divorced from what's happening at home and spending all of their time with their friends. And the stakes are really low. they're low in terms of making mistakes and the repercussions. It's a time when every single kid is making a lot of mistakes. My whole saying with kids themselves is, I don't care if you make more mistakes, just please make a different one next time. But the stakes are high if we don't use this time to really get in there and parent them and coach them and support them in a different way than we did when they were younger, but just as intensively.
Absolutely. And you talk about, in your book, the 10 key skills that kids need to thrive. And not only in middle school, but beyond middle school, high school, and even as an adult, the skills that they need to thrive. And it sounds like you're setting kids up to develop these skills early on, and those same skills can carry them through as they transition to adulthood.
Yes. And when you look at the whole continuum, everything plays into that next phase. So if you don't teach a kid in middle school how to relate to people who are different than them, just using that as one example, at a time when they are so eager to conform, what you then have is a kid who's not very flexible in high school, not able to move from group to group. And we know that the kids who are doing the best in high school are the floaters, the kids who can jump from one group to another. There's no way to develop the skills to do that unless you start when they're younger.
Right. And that really speaks to the social and emotional aspect of this phase. And then you also, of course, have the learning and the academic phase where those expectations are increasing as well. And when I think about the kids that I work with, those who have learning and thinking differences, maybe even like social emotional challenges, there's so many of the skills that you outlined in your book that are so important. A couple stood out, but I said I would say that they're all important, and we don't have time to go through all of them on the podcast. So I'm going to put a link to your book in the show notes because I think it's imperative for everyone who is raising a middle school student or has a child who is approaching middle school, get this book. One of the important things you talk about is the importance of creating homework and organization systems, which are so important to so many students that I've worked with. Can you talk about why that is important, not only for middle school, but and beyond? And what does that look like for parents who want to help their kids?
So one of the things that parents often express concerns about is the fact that their kids don't seem to be internalizing their message that if they have a free day, let's say on a Sunday, and they know they have ice hockey practice Monday and Tuesday, and they have a big project due on Wednesday, that they still do their work at the last minute. And often the parents will conclude that their child is lazy or being oppositional and willful. And so one of the first things I always share with parents, whether or not they have any kind of learning challenge, is that developmentally, the ability to predict how their work effort today impacts what they produce tomorrow doesn't even kick in until age 15. So it's not willful. They literally do not know what they're doing. It's still important to share those tips with kids. They do hear you. And if you doubt me, tell them they can do something and then ask them in 3 months if they remember, and they will. But it takes a lot of practice and scaffolding to actually help them learn how to do it. It's not enough to tell them what they should do. You actually have to spell it out in the same way that you would teach a kid how to make mac and cheese. I'll never forget when my own son was in this age group, my oldest child. He wanted to make macaroni and cheese, and he put the noodles in the unboiled water. And it blew my mind that I actually had to explain to him. First, you boil the water, then you put in the noodles. So in the case of getting organized to do homework, it might look like making sure they have a quiet place to work, making sure that you are helping them keep their backpack organized so that when they're done doing their homework, they're putting it in a folder and not just stuffing it back in the bag or leaving it in the front hall. It might mean that you are helping them plan out what they need to do, or even making a list and talking about how long things will take, and making sure there's no distractions around. In Middle School Matters, I share a story about a team meeting where we were trying to figure out why a child wasn't getting his homework done. And we had been puzzling through this for a long time. And at this meeting, it came out that he was doing his homework next to a talking parakeet.
Oh, my goodness.
And it seems so silly, but we need to really be safeguarding that area where they're working and really treating it as a special part of the house and honoring that time, not asking them to empty the dishwasher in the middle of them doing their homework.
Right. Right. We can't become the distraction to them that takes them off task. And then they have to regroup and figure out where they started, where they left off, what they need to do next. So that's a really important piece as well. And I love that you mentioned the parakeet, because it reminds me of something else you discussed in your book. One of the things you do is you bring in a lot of research, and you talked about having the phone beside them when they're doing homework. And the difference, I think you said there was a full letter grade difference based on the research. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So if you're taking a test and your phone is visible but off, the research shows that you drop a full letter grade. The research also shows that if you do your homework with your phone visible, you're more stressed, you're less efficient. The issue that a lot of parents run into is that kids are incredibly tethered to their phone. It's almost an extension of their body, and it creates anxiety for them not to have their phone on hand. And it creates conflict between you and your child. One of my favorite tips that I share in Middle School Matters was from a design thinker who had twin middle schoolers who were struggling to let go of the phone during homework time. And one of the things he did was put it in a sealed envelope so they could have it on their person, but they couldn't open it until they were done with their homework, which you would also want to turn it off so it's not buzzing and distracting you. But sharing the research with middle schoolers is actually helpful, because then it's not you lecturing them. It is you sharing something that an expert has found in their studies.
Absolutely. And so many parents and even professionals think it's the notifications that are going off that are distracting, and that can be distracting. But just the presence of the phone there, even if it's turned off and the notifications are off, can still be, something that is prompting an internal response to a child. Am I missing a call? Am I missing a text? That creates its own anxiety by having the phone in your presence.
Yes. And then the other stressor that parents often talk to me about with regards to homework relates to the teacher's job versus the parent's job. So the teacher's job is to decide if the child is producing enough information, if it's grade level quality. It's not the parent's job to decide that the child should be writing more than 3 paragraphs. It just creates unnecessary conflict. If there's a mismatch between what you think the child should be producing and what the child is producing, again, whether or not there's a learning challenge, punt that back to the school. Or if they're not doing their homework at all, punt it back to the school and let them work on figuring out what's getting in the way.
And that really speaks to what you said in your book about let the school be the bad guy. I remember reading that, and the parent not be the person who's stepping into that role.
Yes. And if the child is anxious, and sometimes it works the other way around, it's the kid who's creating anxiety for the parent. Maybe they want the parent to just tell them the answer, or they are afraid that they don't understand the directions. And this is where that overlap between the executive functioning and that social emotional need to feel in control that middle schoolers are all experiencing, being careful to tamp down the anxiety without over reassuring. So one example of that was a kid who her father was actually a mathematician, and he loved talking to her about her math homework. She loved talking to him, but only in the service of him giving her the answer so that she could extinguish her anxiety.
Right.
That would make him crazy, but they would end up in a huge fight. And then they would be arguing back and forth, at which point there was no learning that was going to happen because she was too worked up. And what ultimately helped them was to come to an agreement. He promised her that he would give her the answer at a set time as long as she made a good faith effort to understand the directions and listen to his explanation if he needed to help her understand the material.
And that sounds like a great solution to that problem. You don't have that discord between them, and then she has the opportunity to work through the problem before getting the answer.
Yes, it allowed her to exhale and calm down enough to turn on that, her prefrontal cortex and actually solve the problems. And it was a compromise that worked for him as well.
Right. One of the things you talk about is the importance of encouraging balance and setting reasonable expectations. I think that example that you just gave is an example of setting those expectations, right? So I'm not going to give you the answer. You're going to try first, and then I'll give you the answer. And sometimes there's a mismatch in expectations of the child, the expectations of the parent. And I feel like sometimes what I've seen is it can lead to perfectionism, which you talk about in your book. It can lead to anxiety and even self-concept issues. I'd love for you to talk about the importance of that balance for these kids in this developmental period.
Well, first, they look at their parents and they think our lives were a straight line from seventh grade to success.
Right.
So that's the first misconception that they have. The second misconception that most middle schoolers have is that it's easy for everyone but them. And they're just not attuned to where other people are struggling. They're attuned to where they're struggling. And everyone is working at something. And that's a message that we actually have to share. And even the kids whose lives look perfect, who are popular and have all the right clothes and all the right friends, they're struggling too. And it's just a phase where everybody is trying to figure out if they're good enough. Everybody is trying to figure out whether or not they stack up to others. And everybody is acutely self-conscious. And so asking kids outright, what is it you think you should be able to accomplish, just to gauge whether or not they're off base as you're hearing them berate themselves. And they can be so self-critical. If you can actually elicit what they're thinking in their own heads, sometimes you'd be shocked at how relentlessly and mercilessly self-critical they are. That's when you can then break it down and help them see where they're perhaps expecting to accomplish too much too soon, break it into more reasonable steps. I like using an actual ladder and drawing the rungs on the ladder, asking kids to break it down into 5 or 6 rungs on that ladder. And then I add another rung in between each of those rungs and challenge them to break it down even further. And as a parent, one of the things that we can do, especially because kids, especially perfectionists, are so quick to dismiss any progress that they've made, is to actually capture their progress. So if they're trying to learn how to hit a baseball, you're taking some video. If they're trying to draw more realistic figures, maybe you have a portfolio that you're keeping for them, or a math folder, or a writing folder, whatever you can do so that you can look back and say, look at how far you've come, so that they can hold on to that for the next time they're in a similar situation.
Right. And I feel like that builds also their self-awareness, which is something that develops over time as well.
Yes. And sometimes it's helpful to enlist the school when this is happening. If they're spending hours on homework and it doesn't seem right, to check in with the school and find out how long it should be taking. If there's something that's getting in your child's way specifically that you need to address, and making sure that we're also setting reasonable expectations for them. I use the example of not assuming they should be writing 2 pages if the teacher said 3 paragraphs, but we also need to recognize that they may be hitting milestones at uneven rates. Mm-hmm. So they may be doing better in one subject or another, and it can be completely still on track.
Right. And I feel like when we talk about kids who are struggling, and you mentioned those kids who are struggling with learning in your book, for many of those who struggle with learning, there's often an overemphasis on their limitations, on getting support in areas where they're struggling. And it reminds me of that whole idea of balance again, because you talk about the need to also cultivate passions in addition to recognizing and addressing limitations.
So there's 2 ways I think we don't do kids a service. One is to overfreight the importance of doing things you're good at, whether we've invested a lot of money or we've driven them all over the county for travel sports, and then freak out when we hear they don't like it and want to quit. And so kids get the message that they can't quit anything. But the reverse is true too. Kids internalize this idea that they can be that if they're terrible at something or think they're terrible at something, that they shouldn't do it, that they somehow have to have instant mastery for it to be worth their time. And I think we want to be helping kids appreciate that we're not looking for them to be masters at anything yet. We're looking for them to figure out where their strengths and their interests intersect. And you can stick with something and get better. You can shift and try something new if what you're doing isn't working for you. I always say, finish the season, or if your parents paid for a certain number of violin lessons, finish those lessons. I also think kids should do something. They should be trying something and staying involved in different areas. But I think we have to be careful not to strip them of their confidence that they can determine for themselves what they enjoy doing and stick with something whether or not they're good at it, and quit something whether or not they're good at it.
And that can be a tricky balance for parents as well. I love that you mentioned parents have invested all their time. As a mom who spends almost every weekend club sports with both of my kids, it's a lot of not only investment in money, but in our time as parents. And then for a child to say, oh, you know what? I don't want to do that anymore. Then would you recommend that parents say you have to choose something else? Or because what you don't want is your kid to be sitting at home, scrolling the internet instead of doing a sport or being in an activity.
Yes. So if they hate competitive sports, maybe they need to do another activity, or maybe it's just too intense for them and they want to do a rec sport of the same sport. Kind of listening for what it is. It could be that they're lonely because everybody on the team goes to the same school and they go to a different school, and you can either have another friend join them, or maybe the team is just not the right fit, or maybe you need to talk to them about what they would need to do to feel more comfortable, maybe take kids out after practice to get to know them better, but listening carefully to why they want to quit. If they love it, but they want to quit because they feel everyone else is better at them, that's an opportunity for a different kind of conversation too.
Absolutely. And that's where that listening piece is really important, because you want to understand the reason behind them wanting to leave a particular activity, sport, or organization.
Exactly. And I share examples of adults in Middle School Matters, like Vera Wang, who quit figure skating to be a wedding dress designer.
Right.
Changing course isn't necessarily, a recipe for disaster. It can lead them to something that is life-changing for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, there's a lot of research on, even if you think about sports, the kids who try a number of different sports actually do better in the one sport they end up going into than those who stick with that one sport from, age 3 on. It's like atypical to be like a Tiger Woods who's been playing golf since he was 3.
And fewer injuries.
Right. Absolutely. And one of the things you talk about too, we've been talking about academics, we've been talking about balance. There are kids who struggle socially, either because they're impulsive, they're quirky, they have trouble reading social cues, have trouble navigating social relationships. And we know that middle school is such an important time for forming, establishing, maintaining relationships, making good decisions about friends that they have. Are there things, and this could probably be an entire podcast episode, but for parents who see their kids struggling socially, are there things that they should be doing, saying, listening for that would be helpful for kids during this time?
Yes. And I think one of the things we want to be listening for is why they're struggling. Are they struggling because they're standing next to a group of people and they think they're part of the conversation, but they're not saying 2 or 3 words? And there's a mismatch between their skills and what the demands are of middle school age social expectations. Are they struggling because they are impulsive and just too much for their friends and can be a lot and need help figuring out how to develop their social skills without driving away some potentially good matches for them? Are they struggling because they have social anxiety? Are they struggling because they have a lot of difficulty interpreting social cues or considering other people's perspectives? Is the issue that they're trying so hard to impress that they're telling jokes that end up hurting people's feelings? Or maybe they're just trying so hard to be part of a popular crowd that they really want to be part of, and that group isn't accepting them, and that feels bad. And we can't talk a kid out of wanting to be popular, but we can help them figure out what are some right fit friends for right now and steering them in that direction. One thing I will share that's, I think, reassuring is that the greatest difference in happiness is actually between 0 and 1 friend. After that, it's not about the numbers. It is about the quality of the friendship and the nature of the friendship. So if your kid has friends that they can confide in, but they don't have anyone who they can go out with because they're not part of any kind of group, they might be unhappy socially. And the reverse is true too. If they have big groups that they can go hang out with, but they don't feel like they have anyone that they can talk to about things that are important to them, that might be where they're missing the kind of connection that they're seeking. So having conversations about the nature of their friendships and what they wish those friendships look like can help you figure out what they need to do to flesh out their social life.
Right. And you've got some great conversation tips in your book that are really helpful. I've already used some of them with my own middle schooler, and it's been wonderful to have those conversations. One of the things you say in your book is that the good news is that children who face challenges tend to be resilient, know their limits, are good people, and can advocate for themselves. And you say that with the right support, even the most impulsive, struggling child can explode in development. And I know that that is absolutely true.
So true. And the goal is setting them up for success. At least that's always my goal in the school setting too. We want, whether it's a group project at school and you're just front loading a conversation with the teacher about the kinds of challenges they might face, but also their areas of strength and what they might be able to contribute to a group, whether it's asking the teacher to point out in front of the group some of the things they're doing well, because what the teacher in that room says actually has a big impact on how everyone else is experiencing and perceiving your child, whether it's making sure they have lots of really short, brief, structured hangout time with kids so that they're practicing social skills but not overburdening anybody. Or maybe you're giving them an assist by taking out their friends for ice cream after a practice, or having family potlucks with other kids so that they don't have to have that burden of being the host or extending the invitation. And also, it doesn't matter if they're not same age kids. It can even be adults. We want them to be practicing their social skills so that they can learn. What I see often with kids in the school setting is that they're comfortable with adults, but not with kids. And you can lean on the adults to actually work in that time that they're engaging with your child to work on the kinds of commonalities that might help them connect with kids and help them even recognize that they're shying away from being around other kids and more comfortable with adults.
And, you know, when you're giving those examples of things that parents can do to give that assist, I think one of the assists that you give parents are those conversation starters in your book. And many of those conversation starters involve parents sharing their own experiences with their kids. Why is that important for parents, caregivers to do?
For a few reasons. One is that it normalizes that you can have a struggle and come out on the other side. I share a story about a girl who changed schools, and she went to a dance that was for multiple schools in 7th grade. And at that dance, she saw her old friends at her old school, the ones who had actually bullied her. And at the dance, she overheard them making fun of someone else. It wasn't even her, but they were saying that some other girl's dress looked like a carpet. And it brought back all those memories of feeling targeted herself. And she went home and she got in bed with her parents. She was still in her nice shoes and her dress and she just started to sob. And it was the student who was sharing the story with me, and she said what her mom did stuck with her forever. She was already 16 at the time she was sharing the story with me, but what her mom told her was a story about how when she was in middle school, the same thing had happened to her. And what this girl told me was that I looked at my mom and I thought, well, if my mom, who's so awesome and so successful and has so many friends, could go through something like that and be okay, then I can be okay too.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I love that because like you said, it comes down to seeing that you can go through challenges and come out on the other side. And you've got living proof that that is true. And
there's nothing to be ashamed of. Every kid in middle school is going to be dropped by friends. It's just a point worth repeating for our kids. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It's just a time in kids' lives when they're learning how to be a friend and pick a friend. And those are really hard lessons, but we want them to learn these lessons so that when they're older, they're making good choices of a romantic partner or recognizing if they're being mistreated in a work setting. These are skills that we don't actually want to shield our kids from entirely, but we do want to be asking the kinds of questions that I was talking about in the book. Things like, I'm wondering, I've noticed, those are phrases I think I mentioned, like, I've noticed you're not yourself when you're with this particular friend. It seems like you have to try really hard to be part of that group. I'm wondering what that feels like, or if it feels good. Or the reverse, I've noticed you are your silly, goofy, awesome self when you're with this other friend. What's different about that friendship? What's working for you there? And helping them build that cognitive awareness of their social lives.
And then they can internalize the questions that you ask for themselves when they are establishing those relationships and choosing whether they want to continue with relationships as they get older.
That's right. It's the same advice I give with social media, to pay attention to how you feel when you get on an app and off an app, and choose accordingly. Maybe you want to take something off your home screen or delete an app or turn off notifications. If you notice that when you're with a particular person, you always end up feeling overexposed or teased, or like you're trying really hard to insert yourself somewhere where you're not wanted, that's a terrible feeling. You're going to feel lonely. But unless you pause and actually take note of that, you might not have enough awareness to retool and start the process of shifting friend groups.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm thinking about the fact that a lot of the tools that you are outlining in your book really speak to increasing self-awareness. The tools help with decision making, and it helps kids to develop self-advocacy skills, which are so important as well. And there's so much that parents can learn from going through your book. I cannot wait, like I said, to get into the next one. But I just want to thank you for writing an incredible book that really serves as a guide for parents on how to raise strong, resilient, empowered kids and help them develop the skills they need to make good choices and thrive, not only in middle school, but like you said, and beyond. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
It has been, like I said, an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I'm going to put links to your books in the show notes. But if our listeners want to connect with you, what is the best way that they can learn more about you, more about your work? Where can they go, or where should I send them?
So both Middle School Matters and Middle School Superpowers are available anywhere books are available. I have a website, phyllisfagell.com. My handle on most social media is @pfagell. And I also recently helped create an app that is a voice-activated self-coaching app for teens. So it's a way to give your children a tool to help them help themselves. They can tap into their own self-awareness and start to develop even greater self-awareness. If anyone is interested in the app, they can send an email to the address that I know you're going to list in the show notes with the name of the podcast, and we will send them a month free link that they can use.
Wonderful. Thank you again. Thank you for that. And again, thank you so much, Phyllis, for speaking with me today, for being on the podcast. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. Be sure to check out the show notes. There you can get more information about Phyllis and her book and additional resources for supporting kids who learn and think differently. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.